Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us in the night time, and welcome to the webinar series on from global sustainability. And this online talk series is majorly hosted by the Health Working Group features Taipei. And in this online webinar series, several distinguished researchers are invited to share their research experience and also their insight in environmental health and sustainability. I'm Wu Zhida Zhang Wu from the Department of Geomatics, National Cheng Kung University. And today is our first international event, let's say, and it is our great honor to have our old friend, let's say, the Professor Gary Adenkiewicz to come and share with us about his studies in green buildings and residential health. Professor Adenkiewicz got his bachelor's degree from Manhattan College, right? And also Professor Adenkiewicz has 2 master's degrees. One is also from Manhattan colleges, and this one is major in chemical engineering, and the other one is from the Harvard School of Public Health. And Professor Adenkiewicz got his PhD degree from the Massachusetts Institute of Technologies, MIT. And Professor Adenkiewicz is now an associate professor of the Environmental Health and Exposure Disparities, Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. And he is currently, his research interest is mainly focused on the housing-related exposure disparities and intervention, health and healthy urbanizations, and food and our futures. I just checked this kind of information from your websites, so maybe you can talk more by yourself later. Okay, so this is just my brief introduction to Gary. So let's welcome to Professor Adenkiewicz.
Thank you, John. I really appreciate that. Let me just share my slides and I'll get started. Okay, can you see that? Okay, first, good evening, everyone. I'd really like to thank the organizers for the invitation to speak, especially President Jenny Su, Professor Candice Lung, and most especially Professor John Wu for the invitation and the opportunity to be here today. As John said, I'll be talking about green buildings and resident health, a case study of Boston public housing, which is the city in which I work at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Before I start, I'd like to just give a sense of the kind of work we do. In my lab, we tend to focus on 2 key questions. Why does place matter? Why do people get sick in the places that they do? And how can we eliminate health disparities? So in the case where we see differences in health outcomes, how can we eliminate those health disparities that vary by race or by socioeconomic status? We know that genes and environment contribute to health, but we're really interested in how these disparity linkages that could be driven by something such as housing can contribute to poor health. Before I go any further, another thing I like to remind people of is that 9 out of every 10 human breaths are drawn indoors. And that makes indoor environments especially important microenvironments to understand. If you understand the air quality that's existing indoors, it goes a long way to understanding the potential health effects of that exposure. Indoor environments are critically important to understanding environmental exposures broadly. In the last 40 years, we've learned a lot about environmental exposures indoors. And these photographs kind of depict some of the things we've learned about. We've learned about combustion byproducts, smoking, lead paint, chemicals in the home, biological exposures, mold and moisture. We've learned about chemicals from consumer products, from toys, from furnishings. We've also learned that outdoor air pollution finds its way indoors. So if you live in a place that's heavily exposed to traffic, you're going to be exposed to high levels of air pollutants indoors. We've also learned about the connection between energy use and environmental conditions. So I'll give you an example of what all these refer to here. So we've learned a lot about all these different exposures: lead, NO2, fine particles in the air, semi-volatile organic compounds, volatile organic compounds. And the question is, how do you create healthy indoor environments that limit the ability, that foster health and don't take away from resident health? So if you want to address disparities in exposure, it's important to understand ambient exposures, what's happening outdoors. It's important to understand the modifiers of that exposure, the building structure, the building envelope, that sort of thing. Also, human activity and behavior indoors. And it's also important to understand indoor sources. Most of what I'm going to be talking about today really focuses on these indoor exposures. What is happening indoors and how does that affect environmental exposures and ultimately health? So, as I said, we're interested in disparities. In the US, there's a lot of evidence that has been collected looking at how environmental exposures vary by socioeconomic status. We've generally found that low socioeconomic status families are exposed to higher concentrations of many indoor pollutants, such as lead, allergens, mold, pesticides, environmental tobacco smoke, formaldehyde. So we know that there are reasons why those exposures are higher. Sometimes it has to do with a small apartment size. Sometimes it has to do with building materials that are used in that setting. In the case of lead, it has to do with the fact that lead has not been remediated and was once used as an ingredient in household paint. There are some examples of high socioeconomic status families being exposed to some pollutants. Most of that evidence is related to single family homes. So single family homes can have higher exposures in the United States to radon or volatile organic compounds from attached garages. One category of pollutants that can go either way, the arrow can point in either direction, are sort of modern chemicals, semi-volatile organic compounds. This really depends on the specific molecule. So it could be, you could see higher exposures in either high or low SES households. But this is very much part of our framing as we go in to look at exposures within these different settings. So indoor environments are really shaped by sources, structure, behavior, and the settings. So everything from cooking appliances to tobacco smoke, cleaning products, air fresheners, personal care products. Structure matters, the size and design of the structure, the age, the size of the living space, whether you're living in single family or multifamily households. I know the setting in Taipei is many more multifamily households. Behavior matters, source use patterns, cooking appliance usage, cooking practices, smoking behavior. And then in terms of understanding personal exposure to pollutants, activity patterns matter. So how much time do you spend at home? What are your interaction with sources? What's the influence of activity patterns on air exchange? Do people have air conditioning? Do people have windows open? Is there mechanical ventilation in the space? All of that matters. And then the setting. You can have a home that has a pristine indoor environment with no sources, but still be polluted because the outdoor air is polluted. And we know that air is exchanged between outdoor and indoor settings. So all of that matters. It's also important to recognize that we need to take a multi-level view of determinants of exposure. This is especially true in cases where you have multifamily housing or high rises or even low-rise multifamily units, that households exist within buildings and buildings exist within neighborhoods. So your real-time imprint of all these drivers of exposure are really come together to form the imprint of exposure indoors, so that the highs and the lows and the minute-to-minute variation can be affected by all of these things. It could be affected by air pollution that's coming from your next door neighbor in a multifamily setting, or coming from a neighborhood pollutant source. All of these things matter. So the question is, where do you intervene if you care about these kinds of exposures? I like to frame this as a setting where we focus on people, places, and policies. When I talk about places, I'm talking about how we build buildings, how we maintain buildings. So whether we are constructing or renovating buildings, that has an effect on indoor environmental exposures. The other two categories we don't always focus on, the people and the policies. So how people understand their indoor environment. You know, education can be used as an intervention, case management, clinical interventions, you know, making sure that people know how to mitigate environmental exposures within their own home is really important. When I talk about policies, I'm not talking about national policy necessarily, although that can be important for limiting chemical exposures. I'm talking about the policies that exist at the building level. So maintenance policies, purchasing policies, tenant policies, regulatory policies, you know, build everything from building code to whether you have a smoke-free policy. Also, the kinds of practices that you engage in at the building level. We work with a lot of households that have pest problems, insect infestation problems, and how you deal with that problem at the building level, whether you're spraying apartments with pesticide or not, is really important. So my work, the work I'll talk about today, actually focuses on public housing, what people might call social housing. This is where low-income families are live and spend their time. You might ask why focus on this type of housing? Originally, for us, it was motivated by asthma concerns. There was a time when 15 or 20 years ago, if you would see that asthma rates within public housing in Boston were 20, 25, or 30%. So 25% of the children might have asthma, which is more than 2.5 times the national average for asthma in the United States. And so we were concerned that there was something about the housing that was causing this difference in asthma prevalence. We've also done a lot of work showing that specific exposures can be different. So we've done work looking at cockroach allergen and dust mite allergen and shown that these units have higher levels. We've looked at combustion byproducts from gas stoves and shown that levels can be especially high, especially during the winter, and especially in certain rooms like the kitchen where the combustion source is. We've done work on pesticides, showing that pesticide exposures can linger for years. These are studies where we basically wiped a kitchen floor and sent that cotton swab off to the lab to have it measured, quantified for pesticides. We've looked at smoking, primary smoking and secondhand smoking. We've shown that smoking moves from one unit to another, which is not a surprise. We've looked at ventilation, whether folks have adequate ventilation. For most of these families, they don't have kitchen ventilation that vents to the outside. They have what we call recirculating ventilation. And we've tried to also look at all these exposures together. So we know these exposures are high. Even if the exposures weren't the reason why families and children developed asthma, it's important to focus on these exposures because we know asthmatics are more sensitive to many of these exposures than folks without asthma. So this disease burden and this vulnerability is really important. The other reason we focused on public housing is the opportunity for intervention. The Boston Housing Authority, the authority that oversees public housing in Boston, is the largest single landlord in the city of Boston. So as we work with them and we identify better practices to build or maintain or renovate their buildings, we have the potential to improve the conditions for many families, not just the families who are enrolled in our studies. Yeah. So the question is, so we've actually worked with the Boston Housing Authority on many different projects. They've instituted better pest control practices. They've instituted resident education. They've tried to limit chemical exposures. And they also were the largest housing authority in the US to go smoke-free back in 2012. But today I'm just going to talk about these green transitions. They've actually redeveloped certain properties to what you call a green standard. So these are buildings that are designed to be energy efficient, resource efficient, and also contain many aspects that you would call healthy housing attributes. So I'm going to talk about our experience in studying these transitions. So this was part of a study funded by the US government called the BRIGHT study, the Boston Residential Investigation on Green and Healthy Transitions. And up above, you see a picture of one of the sites that we worked on. So we actually worked in 3 sites. These are sort of before and after depictions of the 3 sites. These are all within the city of Boston, Washington Beach, Old Colony, and Barclay homes. You can see in the upper left-hand corner, you can see a picture of what is typical public housing in Boston, usually 3 to 4 story buildings, not elevator buildings. They're usually brick, and they're typically 50 to 60 years old. And many of them have the problems that I already identified with having pest infestation, smoking issues, poor ventilation, all those sorts of things. So the question you might ask, what is green building? I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but green building is the practice of creating structures and using processes that are environmentally responsible and resource efficient. Historically, this has been focused on resources and energy use, but more and more green buildings include aspects that are meant to be healthy. So the use of low emitting building materials, the use of proper ventilation in the kitchen and the bathroom, things like that are, or construction practices that are easy to maintain and clean, things like that. So, put together holistically, we hope that we're building buildings that are both green and healthy for the residents. As I said, most of the buildings that we're working on are 50, 60 years old. This is a picture from the 1940s showing the original construction of one of the sites that we worked on. So this is in the South Boston section of Boston. This is an aerial view. You can see this, it's very easy to see the property. It doesn't necessarily blend in with the surrounding neighborhood, but the idea was to embed these housing developments in neighborhoods and have it be part of the fabric of the local community. These weren't necessarily successful, but they were a way to provide affordable housing for families, working families in need. This is a picture, a more recent picture. This picture is probably 10 years old. This shows the old buildings side by side with the new buildings. So the old buildings are on like the bottom left, those 3-story brick buildings, and then you can see the newer buildings in the center. So you can also see solar panels. So there are many aspects related to energy efficiency that were part of the new buildings. But as I said, these encompass both aspects that are meant to be green and aspects that are meant to be healthy. The site I showed there is called Old Colony. What's really interesting here is that we were really studying a natural experiment. This property was redeveloped in phases. So you actually had families living in the old units side by side with families living in the new units. And if you're going to do a study of housing, many of these studies are confounded by neighborhood, confounded by who's living in the apartments. And it's rare to have people living in exactly the same neighborhood, the same demographics, but whose only difference is the kind of housing that they're living in. So here we had this natural experiment of families, basically the same families. They all have the same eligibility criteria to be living in the housing, living side by side in the same neighborhood. So neighborhood influences on health, local air pollution were the same. And the only difference is they were either now living in old housing, which has all the problems that I mentioned, or this new housing that was designed to be green and healthy. So if you want to study this transition from conventional housing into green, it was a perfect scenario to do that. So we considered this a natural experiment that we could study. As I mentioned, we're focused on people, places, and policies. So we're really looking at the net effect of all of these things. So they were developing the buildings. That's a focus on place. We provided educational materials so that people knew how to keep their home green and healthy. So the educational materials were there. And then the policies that were in place involved better pest control practices that did not rely heavily on pesticides, but focused more on controlling sources of food, water, shelter, and access to pests that can control pest populations. And the other policy that was in place was a no smoking policy. So it's not that smokers were banned, but smoking inside the units were banned. So our ultimate goal for the study was to see how see the effect of all of these different uh, policies together, all of these different approaches, I should say, and how they affect comfort, satisfaction, environmental exposures, health, and energy usage. In picture form, these are really some of the key differences between the conventional and the green units. On the conventional side, when we started, smoking was allowed. We typically had gas stoves. We had air pathways that were largely uncontrolled and many sort of a leaky building shell because these were older buildings. So a lot of uncontrolled air pathways between indoors and outdoors. On the green side, we had smoke-free policies. We had building materials that were designed to be low emitting, and we had a building shell that was tighter, more energy efficient. And we also had proper ventilation in the kitchen and the bathroom. So one of the big differences is that we had ventilation that brought air outside as opposed to recirculating it in the kitchen. And then we made sure to have proper functioning ventilation in the bathrooms to control moisture exposure. So the first thing we did was to look at some key air pollutants. So two of the air pollutants we looked at are pollutants that are regulated by the US government because of their health effects. So fine particles in the air, PM 2.5, and nitrogen dioxide, NO2. We saw pretty dramatic reductions in both exposures. This was a function of both source control and building factors. For the NO2, the main reason we saw that drop is because we switched from gas stoves to electric stoves. Many people don't think of gas stoves as being an exposure source, but they do emit high levels of nitrogen dioxide, which is a known respiratory air pollutant. The PM 2.5 reductions of about 40% is a function of a few things. It's a function of the smoke-free policy, we think. It's also a function of having proper ventilation. The other thing we did is we took the particles that we collected from the air and had them analyzed for sulfur. Sulfur is a really good marker in the US of particles of outdoor origin. And if you look at the sulfur concentrations between our control households, the conventional buildings, and the green buildings had much lower levels of sulfur. So it appeared that this tight building shell was actually acting as a filter to outdoor air. Boston is not the most polluted city in the world or even in the United States, but still outdoor air pollution matters for health. And we saw this reduced infiltration of particles of outdoor origin. So we thought that was very interesting and very much in line with what we were trying to do in redeveloping the buildings and controlling sources of exposure. The other thing we noticed is that, we were doing these studies within a 4-block radius, and we were in buildings that were side by side to each other, old buildings and new buildings. We really could see the differences, where there was smoking allowed inside, we saw much higher levels of fine particles. The green buildings had much lower levels of fine particles. And then duration of cooking in the unit, typical duration of cooking also seemed to be important. So most people look at disparities in air pollution as being a function of the neighborhood, but here we're showing significant within geographic area variability, significant within neighborhood variability that depends on the attributes of the buildings themselves and the policies that are in place. So this is we can really see that exposures are strongly influenced by sources, building age, and occupant activity. So bottom line, we see that if you reduce infiltration of outdoor air pollution, if you have policies that are in place to limit indoor sources of air pollution, that you get an overall reduction to air pollution. So personal exposures and indoor exposures tend to be lower, which matched what we thought going into the study. The other thing we did was start to look at health outcomes. So we asked the adult residents of the household whether they had any symptoms at home in the last 30 days. So here you can see the differences between the green and control. And the ones that are in darker colors are statistically significant. So we saw in general lower symptom reporting in the green households, which matched what we might have expected. When we took those symptoms and actually added it up into a symptom score, we divided the group into three groups. There were individuals who were in conventional homes in both years. There were individuals who were in green homes in both years that we studied, and then there were families who, over that 1 year period, moved from conventional to green. So if you look at the symptom score differences in these three groups, the only group that saw a reduction in symptom score were the families who moved from conventional to green. So this also matches our prior, that the green homes were better for health, and that adult symptoms were reduced in making that transition from conventional to green housing. The other thing we looked at was asthma morbidity. So we didn't recruit families based on whether someone had asthma or not. But since it's public housing in Boston, the asthma rates are fairly high. So we had a fair number of homes with asthmatic children, a fair number of homes with adults with asthma. And you can see the children with asthma, you can see pretty dramatic reductions in asthma morbidity. So missed school days for asthma, hospital visits went down, asthma attacks went down, asthma symptoms went down. For adults with asthma, in general, the trend was for lower levels, but they weren't statistically significant. Everything with a star here is statistically significant. Another way to put these results is in terms of odds ratios. So these are the odds ratios for control children. So in other words, asthma symptoms. So if you lived in a control building, a conventional building, you were almost 3 times more likely to have asthma symptoms. If you lived in a control building, you were more than 3 times more likely to have an asthma attack. If you lived in a control building, you were more than 4 times as likely to have a hospital visit. So these were pretty dramatic results and kind of matched our prior. We thought if anyone was going to be affected by the improved air quality in the homes, it might be children with asthma who are the most sensitive. This is a snapshot of what environmental exposures look like. We had simple indices for whether these were problems. We saw pretty dramatic reductions in pests. Even though smoking wasn't allowed in the new buildings, we didn't see smoking rates go down to 0, but they were dramatically reduced. Inadequate ventilation, much reduced in the green homes, and combustion byproducts. We didn't consider any of the new homes to have exposure to that because the gas stove was eliminated. We know that health and environmental exposures aren't the only thing that people might care about. So we knew that these buildings were being renovated and that we were basically replacing very inefficient old systems. So we looked at electricity, gas, and water usage. And monetize that. And we saw that in this first phase of development at this one site, they were saving approximately $583,000 a year in just the reductions in usage of electricity, gas, and water. So you had highly inefficient uses of electricity. You had inefficient heating systems that were powered by gas, and you also had a lot of leaks in the water system. So even if you didn't care about health, there was a positive benefit to renovating these systems in terms of utility costs. Another thing we looked at was temperature. These were many units in Boston in general in the rental market are overheated. So the temperatures in the winter were more like 75 to 80. And then with the green units, they were properly heated. So people went from overheated to properly heated. This resulted in some families complaining that the units were too cold. But after about a year, that kind of went away as people got used to the new properly heated units. So we had better thermal control. So looking at this all together, we saw reductions in key air pollutants, NO2 and PM2.5 specifically. We saw pretty dramatic improvements in health. We saw improvements in utilities and work orders that result in a pretty significant cost savings. And if you think about, we didn't monetize the health improvements, but if you were to monetize those, that would be a pretty significant number. And if you were to add it to the savings on utilities, it would be a pretty dramatic number. It doesn't necessarily offset the significant cost of new construction, but it definitely shows that you're improving conditions and saving operating costs. We saw more control of thermal comfort. We saw on the downside, we saw some discomfort reported, people reporting that the new units were too cold. We saw reduced extreme responses, and we saw some reports of spot heating. People brought small portable heaters into some of the new units. We haven't published these results, but we saw some increased sleep duration for the new units as well. I should mention that that we did create these educational books that went to every family who moved into a green unit. We thought it was a good opportunity to instruct families on how to keep a unit green and healthy. And there's no better time when people are motivated than moving into a brand new, really nice building. So that was another part of our effort that we invested in, and this was produced in several languages. I should say that we also have published on the complications of providing smoke-free public housing, that it does depend on the physical infrastructure, the staffing, the demographics. If you have aids for smokers, resident engagement is necessary. So you can't just put a policy in place and walk away. So we published this in the American Journal of Public Health. It was named a paper of the year for that year. But we really tried to show how complicated it can be to create a smoke-free indoor environment. So basically the big picture here is that people, places, and policies matter. Indoor sources and indoor exposure to outdoor sources matter. Structure and systems matter, both operations and maintenance. I should say that you can't just build a green building and walk away. There are policies in place to make sure that those buildings stay green and healthy. They're watching utility usage, they're watching pest control problems, and if you really want it to stay green and healthy forever, you need a green maintenance policy in place. We definitely need more research on the full balance sheet, energy, health, quality of life. One of the things we didn't look at, I'm pretty convinced that we might see improvements on educational outcomes for the children who live in these buildings, but we didn't study that because of the limitations of our grant funding. And like I said, healthy conditions need to be maintained. You need systems, maintenance policies, education and outreach are all important to maintaining a healthy indoor environment. I'd like to thank my entire team. It takes a lot of people to do these kinds of studies, and many people have helped over the years. And I'd like to thank our funders, particularly the Department of Housing and Urban Development, for their funding on the BRIGHT study. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Okay, perfect. Wonderful presentation. And thanks for Gary. So for some reasons, we have a very limited time in the Q&A session. So any comment or questions from our audience? You can just raise or open your microphone and share with us your comment or questions. Or if you are very shy, you can just leave your comments in the chat box. Any comment or questions?
Hi, Gary. I'm going first. Yeah, it's great to see. It's great to learn these very comprehensive studies. It's really great to cover a lot of different aspects and also cover different pollutions. I just wonder whether when you survey or do measurement for these housings, are you doing like a seasonal, like every season you visit their household, or how often you visit them, and then to do this? Yeah.
It's a great question. We know that season really matters for pollution. We know that season matters for health. So we were really careful. So for the study, I didn't unpack all the details. So for the study where we looked at the air pollution levels, the NO2 and PM2.5, we made sure we basically focused that on the winter months. And we basically came back when we did the baseline, we did baseline during winter and we did follow up during winter to make sure we were comparing the same season. For the other study, we had data throughout the year. I haven't really focused on the seasonal trends in that data. We have limited power there, but yeah, season definitely matters. When I'm doing these studies and I really want to look at maximal exposures, I tend to do them in the winter when windows are closed and people are most exposed to indoor air pollution.
And my second question is that after you got your research findings, have you feedback to the urban planner or the building builders so they can, design the public housing better so they can live healthier?
Yeah, we've tried to actually. This project received a national award from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and we've tried to give presentations wherever we can. We've given presentations at green building conferences and at national conferences on health, national conferences on indoor air quality, and Boston actually has been a leader in just creating healthier public housing. So when people are looking for good examples, whether it's on the smoke-free policy or green building, they have typically looked to Boston as one of the leaders. New York is another leader. So we've tried to get the word out as much as possible.
Okay, great. And others also have some questions.
Okay, sure.
All right, we have a question from Ida, Mr. or Mrs. or Miss Ida Tsai. You can just open your microphone.
Are you calling me?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's totally fine. Yes, totally fine. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Hi, Gary. My name is Yvonne, and I'm from Delta Electronics Foundation. So actually, my affiliation has for long promoted green building in Taiwan and in the international community. And we know, because we are promoting that, and we know if today you renovate the building envelope, then you definitely could save the energy. And we also know a research from the ACEEE, it just says that if today we have a proper building envelope, then it can modulate the temperature of one building. So when you experience the climate extreme event, then when people stay in that kind of buildings, they wouldn't be affected, significantly affected by the heat or by the coldness. So, but this is actually my first time to hear that if today we renovate the building shells, then we also can it also can be helpful for the health. And we know there are a lot of ways to improve the building shells. And I'm just curious, in your research, which ways that you have adopted?
So I think it's important to recognize that if you only focus on the building shell and nothing else, if you improve the energy efficiency of the building shell, there's a chance to make indoor air quality worse, right? You can just reduce the air exchange, and if there are a lot of indoor sources, you can make it worse. In this case, what we were doing is studying the effect of changing the building shell, but also making sure that people had proper ventilation in the places where they needed it, like the kitchen and the bathroom. So I think it's not, I don't want to give the impression that the building shell, I mean, a building shell can reduce the infiltration of outdoor air pollution. That's definitely true. So if you're living in a very polluted city, it can actually help in that way. But we also know that there are many important indoor sources. So it can allow the buildup of indoor sources. So the key is this works when you have proper ventilation, like mechanical ventilation.
Okay, I see. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the question.
Okay, so we also have a question from Miss Idata, right? Because I see her raise her name, raise her hand. Any questions from Miss Tai?
It seems that he said he it barely touched the icon, so
Okay, got you. No worry. So we also have a question from Professor Zhao, Jasmine Zhao. Appreciate your comments.
Hi, Gary. Very wonderful project and interesting findings. I have a technical question about the ventilation because you mentioned that you found sulfur concentration in PM 2.5 in the green building, well, in the greenhouses were lower compared to other controls, which means that outdoor pollutants, they don't really get into the apartment. However, you also say that closed greenhouses or apartments, they have lower inadequate ventilation, which means that they probably have better ventilation. So how can you increase ventilation in the same time that you reduce outdoor pollutants bringing inside the environment?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the increased ventilation is really spot ventilation. So it's, it's above the kitchen stove and in the bathroom. So that's used to, reduce, these peak level exposures. But for most of the day, there would just be natural infiltration of pollutants of outdoor origin. And we think that that the building shell basically helped to reduce that. I know what you mean. We're basically increasing ventilation, and then I said that we were reducing ventilation. But basically, the infiltration is coming from all the different possible pathways through the building shell, and the ventilation, the active ventilation we have is really spot ventilation in the kitchen and the bathroom.
Okay. So you don't specifically encourage the occupants to open their windows or doors? No.
No.
Not really. Okay. I see. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Due to the time limitation, maybe we can take the last one. I think we also have a comment on the chat box, right? So maybe I can just read it. Professor Gary, okay, Gary, could you expand the cost needed to change the conventional houses into a greenhouse, and also the difference in maintenance fee between the conventional house and the greenhouses? Thanks. Everything about money.
Yeah, no, I think let me think of the costs. I mean, these costs, if you look at the total, okay, the intervention here was new construction, which included the new construction of the units as well as common areas and a meeting hall, basically. If you look at the per unit costs of the intervention, it was more than 400,000 US. So it's not cheap. And then the maintenance fee, I don't really have good numbers on that. You know, these pest control practices, they cost a little more money, but they're better in the long term. So they involve some upfront costs, but they lower operating costs in the long run. So I don't really have a good number for the difference in the maintenance fees. In general, the green buildings are actually easier to maintain than the old buildings because the old buildings have a lot of deferred maintenance and also have a lot of work orders due to pest problems and other situations like that. Great question.
Okay. Yeah, perfect. I'm very sorry. I know there are some of our audience still have some questions, but due to the time limitation, we might not be able to make it. And also the other one, the last one, very important things, we have to take a group photo, right? According to the suggestion from the coordinators. So I think it's time for us. Please do us a favor if you can turn on your webcam. Please turn it on so they take a group photo together. So Dolly, can you please guide us to take a photo?
Again, we invite you to open your camera to take a photo with Professor Gary in a very special opportunity. So please open your camera and be ready your smile. Okay, ready? Okay, 3, 2, 1. Again, 3, 2, 1. Maybe we can have a special pose, such as a heart, a good heart, and a good health.
I think we need to have a
health.
strong heart for the COVID to fight against with the COVID.
Hope we can have a good heart and a good health. Okay, 3, 2, 1. Like this. 3,
The next one.
1.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, perfect.
Thank you, all guys.
Yeah. Okay. So thanks again for Professor Adekowitz to come and share with us his findings, and we are really appreciate your efforts and also you sharing your experience. And we know Professor Adekowitz is going to come back to the next event. So, but thanks again. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sean. I really appreciate the chance to speak with you today. I really appreciate the invitation.
Yeah, I definitely keep in touch. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Perfect. Yeah.
Thank you.
And thanks
Bye-bye.
for all of our participants and have a good night.
Bye, Candace.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
See you in another
good night.
single air quality
Holly.
conference.
Yes.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye. Take care.